Welcome to the Carmen-Smith Resource Protection Training. This training is designed to inform EWEB employees, contractors, and partner agencies working within the Carmen-Smith project boundaries of the various resource protection requirements identified in the 2016 Carmen-Smith Settlement Agreement, efforts EWEB has made to implement those protections, and the role you play in ensuring compliance with those protections. Although this training focuses on efforts being implemented along the Carmen-Smith transmission corridor, the protections and restrictions it describes pertain to all areas within the project boundaries. EWEB has many ties to the McKenzie Valley. We get our drinking water from the McKenzie River, and we have several hydroelectric facilities along the river. EWEB owns 2 canal-based projects along the lower run, as well as a series of diversion and generation dams at the upper reach known as the Carmen-Smith project. Power from the Carmen-Smith project is wheeled down a 19-mile corridor to the Cougar Tap where it flows into the BPA system. 60% of the corridor is on national forest lands, while the other 40% runs through easements along private properties. This system was built in the early 1960s. For over 50 years, the Carmen-Smith transmission corridor and other portions of the project were managed through a traditional cyclical mowing round, averaging 3 to 5 years per cycle. This was the generally accepted standard for maintaining clearance along transmission corridors. The process had several inherent adverse effects beyond the simple use of petroleum and potential for sparking fires. The continual mowing of the corridor and project areas drastically limited habitat by removing all of the native plant material and cover that wildlife would utilize. It also increased the potential for erosion. Another adverse effect of mowing the corridor and project areas is the potential to damage archaeological sites. EWEB has identified several archaeological sites within the Carmen project boundary, including several areas along the transmission corridor. These sites can be very important to historians and to the tribes, not only for their intrinsic connection, but for the information they could potentially provide to our understanding of the historic uses of the McKenzie Valley. Mowing, particularly with flail mowers, can disrupt the soil and scatter, damage, or even destroy archaeological artifacts. Similarly, any ground clearing activity or even the use of heavy equipment in these areas has the potential to disturb these sites. One of the more obvious adverse effects of this mowing cycle is the suppression of native species. Natives tend to be slow to respond to such drastic scarification. If they survive at all, they are often outcompeted by invasive non-native weed species. The results of this process are often complete domination by invasive species. These weeds offer little habitat and are often highly flammable. The long-term result of this management was the creation of miles of corridor filled primarily with highly flammable invasive species and some quick-growing native trees. This area provided very little habitat for native wildlife and retained the adverse threats we've just described. The 2008 Carmen-Smith Settlement Agreement, revised in 2016, called for numerous areas of environmental protections. These areas of protection are requirements contained within several of the resource management plans. They include the control of invasive weeds, the protection of vulnerable species, the creation and improvement of wildlife habitats, the protection and encouragement of culturally significant species, and the protection of archaeological and historic sites. Controlling invasive weeds. Weed populations were identified and surveyed and plotted in 2008 and have been updated regularly following the 2019 license issuance. Standards and goals for managing the various weed populations were determined and are now in practice. Likewise, several species of special status plant and wildlife species have been identified as existing within or near the project boundaries. required protections of these species within and near the project boundaries were established and are now in practice. We're working to create and improve wild habitat with specific guidelines for the creation of early seral vegetation and other varied wildlife habitat as defined. Created standards to promote and protect populations of culturally significant plants for access and use by tribal members. The transmission corridor in particular represents a unique opportunity in that it contains miles of open terrain protected by gates and yet accessible with access on foot or by vehicle with permissions. EWEB is working to protect archaeological and historic sites. The numerous archaeological sites that have been identified and potentially undiscovered sites are now protected from the adverse effects of the mowing cycle. All of these goals and protections had to be met while ensuring that the corridor meets line clearance standard. If we can't do this while maintaining safe corridors, we're back to mowing. First step was to create a new line clearance guideline specific to the Carmen-Smith transmission corridor. This included maintaining vegetation at a maximum of 5 foot directly below the power lines and within a 10-foot radius around all towers and guys. It also allows for maintaining vegetation below 15 feet along the border zone from the line area to the limit of the standard corridor. We'll be allowing for a gradual height increase on what will become an expanded corridor beyond the 70-foot standard and the removal of hazard trees as identified. In order to meet the requirements just described, beginning in 2010, EWEB made the decision to manage the entire corridor solely by hand. By utilizing hand labor to manage the T-line vegetation, we're able to avoid impacts to protected areas by being both selective and precise in the removal of invasive species as well as undesirable tall-growing native species. Large portions of the T-line are now full of diverse native plants. There's an abundance of accessible, culturally significant plants. Archaeological areas are protected from disturbance, and the crews are able to sweep through the entire corridor annually and are allowing certain shrubby tree species to remain in the corridor. For over 12 years now, EWEB has been managing the Carmen-Smith transmission corridor and other portions of the project solely by hand. We've made significant investments in the protections required under the settlement agreement and are starting to reap some of the rewards. So what's your role in all of this? Protection, communication, and reporting. Protection of the numerous resources and our investment. We've created a greatly increased habitat and resource protections at significant expense to the utility. Being mindful of those resources and investments and following some simple guidelines will avoid unnecessary impacts during operational maintenance. This applies to anyone performing work within the Carmen-Smith project. To protect these resources as we move forward, EWEB has created a series of protection zones to help to identify various levels of restrictions and to define standards for avoiding, managing, and reporting impacts. Before beginning routine operations and maintenance work, open the Carmen-Smith Operations GIS database and check for any potential work restrictions in the area, which are called protection zones. If the map shows that the planned work will take place in a protection zone, contact environmental management before proceeding. Before beginning ground disturbing or other non-routine work at a project, fill out a project review form and contact environmental management so that they can assist with any necessary protections. And again, this applies to anyone doing work within the Carmen-Smith project. This is an example of protection zones identified in the Carmen-Smith Operations Viewer. Specific guidance on the use of this program will be provided for in a separate training. There are a few key points to remember when working within the Carmen-Smith project. Time your work. Ensure that any noise-producing activities are carried out during non-nesting periods for protected wildlife. Stay on the access roads. If you're able to perform your work without leaving the access roads, and the work has been timed for wildlife protections, there's no need for further coordination. Vehicles entering the Carmen project from other areas can contain mud or other debris containing weed, seed, or vegetative remnants with the potential to germinate and invade the Upper McKenzie system. Do your part to make sure that all vehicles are free of weeds and debris that could harbor weed seed. All vehicles and equipment entering the Carmen project are required to be cleaned of such debris. Pre-wash EWEB vehicles at the rock, including use of the undercarriage sweep, and contractors ensure your vehicles are clean prior to departure from town. All EWEB employees and contractors working on the Carmen project are our eyes and ears with the ability to help protect our resources and our investment. Disturbed areas, including ruts, areas of freshly exposed soils, and holes, can be an indication of people harvesting species or searching for artifacts. If you see disturbed areas within the project, report them to your supervisor or Carmen staff or contact EWEB's cultural liaison. Comparatively, very little is known about the historic uses of the McKenzie Valley, as it was more seasonally utilized than the lower Willamette Valley. Therefore, any information gained in new archaeological finds is highly valuable to gaining a broader understanding of those traditional uses. Familiarize yourself with EWEB's inadvertent or accidental archaeological finds protocol shown here. If an artifact is found on the surface of the ground, note its location, leave it in place, and call the cultural liaison as soon as possible. You can continue non-ground disturbing activities as long as the artifact is not disturbed. If a cultural artifact is unearthed during site work, stop work immediately. Leave the unearthed resource in place and contact the cultural liaison. If necessary, protect the site from further damage and restrict access, particularly in cases involving human remains. Similar to our responsibility in reporting archaeological finds, EWEB is required to report any discovery of injured or dead fish or wildlife. Please follow the above standards whenever reporting is possible. Report to your supervisor or Carmen staff. Thank you for participating in this training. Remember, we're relying on you to help us protect our valuable resources and investments. Don't hesitate to use the contact information here to reach out with any questions.